didn't explode. It froze. One calm senator, one former attorney general, and a single question so precise it cut through 5 minutes of legal fog like a blade. Who decides what is unconstitutional, you or the Constitution itself? What followed wasn't shouting, it was something far more devastating. It was a slow, surgical dismantling, live on camera. The hearing room had the sterile chill of a place designed to drain emotion out of conflict. All pale wood, muted microphones, and flags standing at attention like silent witnesses. Fluorescent lights washed the space in an even, unforgiving brightness that left nowhere to hide. No corner where hesitation or uncertainty could retreat unnoticed. Staffers lined the walls, laptops open, fingers hovering but still, waiting for something worth recording. The cameras were already live, red lights blinking steadily, broadcasting not just testimony, but posture, tone, and every microscopic shift in expression to an audience far beyond the walls of the Capitol. Senator John Kennedy sat calmly behind the dais, shoulders relaxed, papers stacked with deliberate neatness. He looked almost amused, not in a mocking way, but in the manner of someone who already understood the shape of the argument before it began. Years in courtrooms and committee rooms had taught him that the most dangerous questions are rarely the loud ones. Across from him, Sally Yates took her seat at the witness table, back straight, chin level, the practiced composure of a career prosecutor settling into place. She knew the stakes. She also knew that, for many watching, this hearing was not about nuance. It was about whether her refusal to defend the president's executive order was an act of principle or an act of defiance. Kennedy began with courtesy, thanking the witnesses for their service, his voice soft, measured, almost soothing. It was the kind of opening that lowers defenses, that signals respect, even as it sets the trap. He turned to Yates and told her he wanted to start with her, nothing fancy, just a few questions to understand her thinking. His tone suggested curiosity rather than accusation, and for a moment the exchange felt almost collegial. Then he asked the question that would anchor the entire confrontation. She had declined to support and defend President Trump's executive order because she believed it was unconstitutional, correct? Yates answered without hesitation. That's correct, yes. There was no reaction from Kennedy. No visible shift, just a brief pause that let the words settle into the record. He followed up immediately, asking whether she believed no reasonable argument could be made in its defense. This time, Yates slowed slightly. She reframed, explaining that she would not put it that way, that the Department of Justice had gone through an internal analysis. Kennedy interrupted gently, apologizing, saying he had a lot of questions and limited time. The apology sounded sincere, but it also asserted control. The tempo now belonged to him. He told her he was trying to understand her perspective. That phrase mattered. It framed what followed not as a cross-examination, but as a clarification, an invitation to explain herself fully. Yates took it. She explained that, to defend the executive order, DOJ lawyers would have had to argue that it had nothing to do with religion, that it was not motivated by an intent to discriminate against Muslims. She emphasized intent, repeating the word as if anchoring her entire decision to it. Constitutional analysis, she said, requires looking at what you are trying to accomplish. It was a familiar argument, one she had likely made countless times before in briefs and internal memos. Kennedy listened without interruption, eyes fixed on her, nodding slightly. When she finished, he acknowledged her explanation, then pivoted. Suppose, he said, instead of an executive order, this had been an act of Congress. Would you have refused to defend it then? The hypothetical was clean, surgical, stripping away the personality of the president and replacing it with the authority of the legislature. Yates answered honestly. If it were the same act, yes. The words were barely out of her mouth before the implications became clear. She had just extended her logic beyond Trump, beyond executive power, into the heart of congressional authority. Kennedy seized the moment, invoking precedent. The Department of Justice, he noted, had refused to defend statutes before, citing the Defense of Marriage Act. Wasn't that a political decision? He asked. Yates demurred, saying she had not been at Main Justice at the time and could not speak to the reasoning. The exchange was brief, but it accomplished something important. It placed her decision within a pattern, one that critics had long argued cut along partisan lines. Kennedy did not accuse her of bias. He did not need to. The comparison did the work for him. He returned again to the core question, narrowing it further. Did she believe the executive order was constitutional or unconstitutional? Yates attempted to thread the needle, saying she was not convinced it was constitutional and could not, in good conscience, send lawyers into court to argue something she did not believe to be true. Kennedy pressed, restating the question in simpler terms, forcing a binary answer. Eventually, she said it. She believed it was unconstitutional. The admission hung in the air, heavier now that it had been stripped of qualifiers. Kennedy nodded, as if checking a box, then leaned forward slightly. He prefaced his next question with a bit of self-aware humor, joking about waxing metaphysical, acknowledging that the language might sound frustrating. The room relaxed just enough for the blade to land cleanly. At what point, he asked, does an act of Congress or an executive order become unconstitutional? The question was deceptively simple, phrased in plain English, but it cut directly to the foundation of the American legal system. Yates began to answer by returning to analysis and intent. But Kennedy stopped her, apologizing again, explaining he did not have much time. He restated the question more bluntly. If he personally looked at a statute and believed it unconstitutional, did that belief itself make it so? The room grew noticeably quieter. Staffers stopped typing. Yates shifted slightly in her chair, aware now that she was standing on a narrowing ledge. She explained the Department of Justice's dilemma, that defending the order would have required lawyers to argue it had nothing to do with religion. Kennedy listened, then reframed yet again. At what point, he asked, does something become unconstitutional? Is it an a priori determination? Then came the line that drew a ripple of restrained laughter through the room. Who appointed you to the United States Supreme Court? The question was not shouted. It was delivered almost conversationally, but its implication was unmistakable. Courts decide constitutionality, not prosecutors. Yates acknowledged that acts of Congress are presumed constitutional, though not always upheld. She clarified that she was not on the Supreme Court and did not claim to be. She described wrestling deeply with her decision, emphasizing that it was not taken lightly. Kennedy listened, nodding, then summarized her position back to her. She believed it was her responsibility, as Attorney General, to refuse presidential directives she believed unlawful or unconstitutional. When she said yes, Kennedy accepted it with a simple acknowledgement. I get it. The exchange had reached its core. Without raising his voice, without accusing her of bad faith, Kennedy had drawn a stark contrast between personal conviction and constitutional process. The room felt it. Yates felt it. And as the hearing moved forward, that contrast lingered, setting the stage for everything that would follow. A quiet but unmistakable challenge that would only intensify as the questioning continued. Kennedy did not rush forward after that exchange, and the restraint was intentional, because momentum in a courtroom or a hearing is not built by speed but by pressure that accumulates invisibly until there is nowhere left for it to go. He shuffled his papers slowly, as if the document in front of him mattered, even though everyone in the room could sense that the real record had already been made in spoken words and captured glances. Yates sat with her hands clasped now, fingers interlaced more tightly than before, her shoulders still squared but no longer relaxed, as if the chair beneath her had become slightly less stable. The air felt thicker, not with hostility, but with the quiet recognition that something structural had just been exposed. This was no longer a disagreement about one executive order, but about how power moves through the American legal system when personal judgment collides with institutional duty. Kennedy leaned forward again, not to repeat himself, but to let the implications of what had already been said sink deeper into the room. He spoke in a tone that suggested patience rather than triumph, as though he were guiding the audience through a logical sequence they were expected to follow on their own. The Department of Justice, he implied without stating outright, is not meant to be a roving constitutional court, nor is it designed to elevate individual belief over established process. Yates had framed her refusal as an ethical stand, but Kennedy was reframing it as a constitutional anomaly, one that raised uncomfortable questions about precedent. If every attorney general exercised the same discretion, the system itself would become unstable, subject to the convictions of whoever happened to hold office. Yates responded by returning to the language of professional obligation, emphasizing again that her decision was not about disagreement with policy, but about refusing to advance an argument she believed was untrue. She spoke carefully, as if each word were being weighed not only by Kennedy, but by future critics and defenders alike. Her voice remained steady, but the cadence had changed, the pauses longer, the explanations more layered, as though she were building insulation around her position. Kennedy did not interrupt this time, allowing her to speak, allowing the fullness of her justification to unfold uninterrupted. The silence that followed was heavier precisely because he had let her finish. When he resumed, Kennedy did not challenge her ethics, nor did he question her sincerity, because doing so would have shifted the debate into territory where emotion could overwhelm structure. Instead, he returned to role, to architecture, to the idea that in a constitutional republic, good faith is not enough. He spoke of presumptions, of how acts of Congress carry with them a default legitimacy, precisely because they are the product of a co-equal branch. Executive orders, he suggested, exist within a similar framework, constrained and tested by courts, not by the unilateral judgment of executive lawyers. The words were measured, almost gentle, but the implication was sharp. Yates's decision, however principled, had stepped outside that framework. The room reacted subtly, with small movements rather than audible responses. A senator shifted in his seat, another leaned back. Staffers exchanged quick glances before returning to their screens. Yates's eyes flicked downward for a brief moment, then back up again, as if she were recalibrating her stance in real time. Kennedy noticed, as he always did, because these hearings are as much about what is not said as what is. He adjusted his glasses and let another pause stretch, the kind that forces reflection rather than reaction. It was the pause of someone confident that the audience was keeping up. Kennedy then widened the lens again, returning to the broader institutional implications of her position. He did not say it explicitly, but the question hovered unmistakably in the air. What happens when this logic is applied by someone less careful, less restrained, less committed to constitutional balance? Yates had spoken of conscience, but conscience is subjective, and the law is not. The Department of Justice cannot function if its obligations fluctuate with individual belief, because then the rule of law becomes contingent, conditional, and ultimately fragile. Kennedy's point was not that Yates was wrong to wrestle with her decision, but that the system cannot rely on wrestling alone. Yates pushed back as best she could, reiterating that the Attorney General has an obligation to refuse unlawful directives, that history and precedent support such refusals in extraordinary circumstances. She spoke of her responsibility to the Constitution, her duty to say no when necessary. Kennedy listened, nodding, as if acknowledging the nobility of the sentiment even as he prepared to dismantle its application. Duty to the Constitution, he implied, does not grant unilateral authority to declare its meaning. That authority is distributed by design, fractured deliberately to prevent precisely the concentration of judgment Yates was defending. The exchange took on a quieter intensity now, the kind that does not translate easily into viral clips, but leaves a deeper imprint on those paying attention. Kennedy's questions became less frequent, more surgical, each one building on an answer already given rather than introducing new ground. Yates's responses, while still articulate, grew increasingly defensive, as though she were aware that every clarification narrowed her room to maneuver. The dynamic had shifted from explanation to justification, from confidence to containment. It was not a collapse, but it was a retreat. Around them, the hearing room seemed to contract, the distance between dais and witness table feeling shorter, more intimate. Kennedy's earlier humor, light and disarming, was now absent, replaced by a steady seriousness that underscored the gravity of the moment. He was not prosecuting a crime, he was interrogating a philosophy. Yates understood this, and the understanding showed in the way she leaned slightly forward, as if trying to bridge a gap that logic itself had opened. The cameras captured it all, knowing that viewers would read these physical cues as carefully as the words. By the time Kennedy eased back again, the contours of the conflict were unmistakable. On one side stood the belief that personal integrity sometimes requires institutional defiance. On the other stood the conviction that institutions exist precisely to constrain personal certainty. Neither position was caricatured, and that was what made the exchange so compelling. Kennedy had not shouted her down, and Yates had not crumbled. But the imbalance was evident in the way the argument now sat heavier on her shoulders than on his. As the hearing moved toward its next phase, the earlier questions continued to echo, shaping how everything else would be heard. Yates's testimony was no longer evaluated solely on its merits, but through the lens Kennedy had provided, a lens that asked whether conviction alone is sufficient to override constitutional process. The audience at home, many of whom might not follow the intricacies of constitutional law, could still grasp the central tension. It was the tension between feeling certain and being authorized, between knowing what one believes and knowing who gets to decide. The confrontation had not ended, but it had reached a critical midpoint, a place where the stakes were clear and the trajectory set. Kennedy had laid the groundwork for what was to come, and Yates had revealed the limits of her defense without conceding its righteousness. The hearing pressed on, but the story had already taken shape, a slow-burning courtroom drama playing out not with objections and gavels, but with pauses, questions, and the relentless logic of a system designed to distrust certainty. As the hearing advanced into its most consequential phase, the earlier tension did not dissipate. It condensed. What had begun as an inquiry into one executive order now felt like a referendum on how the American legal system survives moments of moral certainty. Kennedy understood that this was the point where arguments either fracture or harden, and he chose precision over volume. He did not introduce new accusations or raise his voice. Instead, he returned to the record already established, tightening the circle around Yates's position until the implications could no longer be ignored. He spoke again about presumption, about how the law operates on defaults, not because defaults are perfect, but because they are stabilizing. Acts of Congress are presumed constitutional not as a courtesy to lawmakers, but as a safeguard against chaos. Executive orders, though different in origin, exist within the same gravitational pull, tested by courts, restrained by injunctions, refined through adversarial process. Kennedy let those principles sit in the air without embellishment, trusting the audience to grasp what followed naturally from them. If those presumptions can be overridden by personal judgment inside the executive branch, the system begins to tilt. Yates listened intently, her posture unchanged, but her expression more guarded. She responded by emphasizing again the extraordinary nature of the circumstances, the weight of the evidence she believed demonstrated discriminatory intent. She spoke of statements, of context, of a pattern that made defending the order untenable. Her words were careful, precise, the language of someone accustomed to persuading judges. Yet Kennedy was not a judge in this moment, and the room was not a courtroom. He was interrogating the premise beneath her reasoning, not its factual scaffolding. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, eyes focused, and asked a question that seemed almost redundant, but was anything but. If courts exist to determine constitutionality, he asked, what role remains for the Department of Justice when a law has not yet been struck down? The question forced a choice. Either DOJ is an advocate bound to defend laws until a court says otherwise, or it is an independent arbiter empowered to preempt that judgment. Yates attempted to reconcile the two, arguing that advocacy cannot extend to advancing claims one believes to be false. It was a principled answer, but Kennedy had already framed the counterpoint. Belief is not verdict. The exchange slowed. Each sentence weighed more carefully than the last. Kennedy allowed Yates to finish her thought, then summarized it back to her with surgical clarity. She believed her duty to the Constitution required refusal in this case. He accepted that premise for the sake of argument, then asked what limiting principle prevented that duty from becoming discretionary power. The question hung in the air, unanswered, because any answer risked conceding either too much authority or too little restraint. Yates paused, longer than before, then spoke about history, about moments when officials refused to carry out unlawful orders. She cited tradition, conscience, the moral arc of the law. Kennedy listened, nodding slowly, but his eyes never left her. When she finished, he did not dispute the examples. Instead, he asked whether those moments were validated by subsequent court rulings. The implication was unmistakable. In each case, she referenced, legitimacy ultimately flowed from judicial confirmation, not from initial refusal. The room reacted subtly again, a collective intake of breath, a shift in posture. This was the fulcrum. Kennedy was not denying the possibility of justified refusal. He was insisting on where that justification ultimately resides. Yates's earlier certainty now appeared hemmed in by her own acknowledgement of judicial authority. She could not claim final say without contradicting the very structure she invoked. Kennedy allowed another silence to stretch, longer this time. Silence in a hearing is not emptiness. It is pressure. It invites reflection, forces witnesses to confront the implications of their own words. Yates held her composure, but the tension was visible in the way her shoulders tightened, the way her gaze fixed forward rather than meeting Kennedy's eyes. She was no longer explaining. She was enduring. Then Kennedy shifted lanes again, with the same deliberate control he had shown earlier. He brought the conversation back to intelligence and foreign interference, not as a distraction, but as reinforcement of his theme. He asked both Yates and Director Clapper whether Russia had attempted to influence the election. The answers were immediate, unambiguous. Yes. Kennedy followed up, asking whether there was evidence that the outcome itself had been changed. Clapper responded carefully, emphasizing limits, authority, and evidence, stating that the intelligence community could not make that determination. Kennedy nodded, absorbing the answer, then delivered his understated observation. It sounded like they tried and failed. The line drew restrained laughter, not because it trivialized the issue, but because it crystallized a principle. Attempt is not outcome. Suspicion is not proof. Even in matters of national security, the system resists certainty without evidence. The parallel to the earlier exchange was unmistakable. Yates's expression shifted almost imperceptibly at that moment, a flicker of recognition passing across her face. The juxtaposition was deliberate and effective. In one context, restraint and evidentiary limits were praised as responsible governance. In another, restraint had been set aside in favor of conviction. Kennedy had not accused her of hypocrisy, but the contrast spoke louder than any accusation could. As the questioning continued, the earlier confidence that had anchored Yates's testimony seemed to erode, replaced by a more defensive posture. Her answers remained articulate, but they now carried the weight of justification rather than explanation. Kennedy, by contrast, appeared increasingly at ease, not because he was enjoying the exchange, but because his argument no longer required active construction. It was already standing, reinforced by her own admissions and by the structure of the system he kept returning to. The hearing room felt smaller now, the distance between questioner and witness compressed by the intensity of the exchange. Kennedy's voice remained even, almost gentle, but every word landed with cumulative force. He did not need to say that the Constitution is not a matter of feeling. He had shown it repeatedly through analogy, through sequence, through restraint. Yates, for all her experience, found herself with fewer places to stand, without contradiction. As this phase of the hearing drew toward its close, the dynamic was unmistakable. Kennedy was no longer probing. He was confirming. Each question served to lock in the record, to ensure that the philosophical divide had been clearly articulated and could not later be softened or reframed. Yates had defended her decision with integrity and intelligence, but the structure of her defense now appeared vulnerable to the very principles she claimed to uphold. The cameras captured the moment when Kennedy leaned back slightly, hands folding again, signaling that this chapter of the exchange was nearing its end. There was no declaration, no dramatic flourish. The power of the moment lay in its quiet inevitability. The audience watching at home, regardless of political allegiance, could sense that something fundamental had been clarified, not resolved, but clarified. This was not about who won an argument. It was about who bore the burden of proof, and where that burden belongs in a constitutional republic. Kennedy had pressed that question relentlessly, and by doing so, he had transformed a single decision into a broader meditation on authority, restraint, and the limits of individual certainty. As the hearing moved on, the echo of that meditation remained, setting the stage for a final reckoning that would not require further questions to be understood. As the hearing approached its final stretch, there was a palpable sense that nothing further needed to be proven, only acknowledged. The arguments had already been laid bare, not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Each question stacking neatly on top of the last, until the structure could support its own weight. Kennedy did not press forward aggressively now. He let the room breathe, understanding that the most enduring conclusions are the ones audiences reach themselves. Yates sat quietly, posture still disciplined, but the energy around her had shifted from authority to endurance, from assertion to containment. Kennedy glanced down the dais, briefly acknowledging the other members, then returned his attention to the witnesses. His demeanor was calm, almost reflective, as if the hearing had moved from interrogation to summation. He did not repeat his earlier points, because repetition would have dulled their edge. Instead, he allowed the logic already on the record to stand, trusting that anyone paying attention could trace the line from premise to consequence without further guidance. The Constitution, after all, does not announce itself loudly. It operates through structure, through restraint, through the refusal to allow any single actor to become the final word. Yates seemed to recognize this shift as well. Her earlier answers had been proactive, explanatory, even assertive. Now they were measured, careful, framed as clarifications rather than declarations. She was no longer trying to persuade Kennedy. She was speaking to the larger audience, to history, to those who would later replay this hearing as a test of principle. Her commitment to conscience remained clear, but it now carried the weight of having been tested against institutional limits. The distinction mattered, and it lingered in the silence between questions. Kennedy's final contributions were subtle but decisive. He did not accuse, nor did he exonerate. Instead, he contextualized. He spoke briefly about the fragility of systems that rely on individual certainty rather than procedural discipline. He reminded the room, implicitly, that the American legal framework was designed to slow decision-making precisely because certainty can be dangerous when it is unchecked. Courts exist not to validate belief, but to test it, to subject it to adversarial scrutiny, to ensure that even the most confident assertions are forced to survive challenge. The intelligence discussion returned one last time, not as a focal point, but as an echo. The acknowledgement that Russia attempted to interfere, paired with the admission that there was no evidence the outcome had changed, stood as a quiet metaphor for the entire hearing. Attempt does not equal result. Suspicion does not equal proof. Belief does not equal authority. The system resists those shortcuts by design. Kennedy never spelled this out explicitly, but the parallel was unmistakable, and its resonance deepened the impact of everything that had come before. As the chairman began to move the hearing toward its conclusion, the room seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had built slowly over the course of the exchange did not dissipate so much as settle into something heavier and more reflective. This had not been a spectacle. There were no viral outbursts, no theatrical indignation. What had unfolded was quieter and, in many ways, more unsettling. It forced a reckoning not with personalities, but with principles that do not bend easily to moral certainty. Kennedy gathered his papers again, the same deliberate motion he had used earlier, signaling closure without ceremony. Yates remained still, hands folded, gaze forward. She had defended her decision with intelligence and sincerity, and nothing in the exchange suggested otherwise. Yet sincerity had not been the question. Authority had. The hearing had drawn a clear line between believing something is unconstitutional and having the institutional mandate to declare it so. That line, once illuminated, could not be unseen. The cameras continued to roll even as the formal questioning ended, capturing the small human details that linger after words are done. A slight tightening of the jaw, a measured breath, the shuffle of papers. These moments, often ignored, told their own story about the cost of public service when principle collides with structure. Yates had acted according to her understanding of duty. Kennedy had acted according to his understanding of constitutional design. The clash between those understandings had been respectful, disciplined, and relentless. As viewers watched from home, many likely felt a familiar discomfort. It is easier to root for conviction than for process, easier to admire moral clarity than procedural restraint. Yet the hearing had quietly challenged that instinct. It suggested that the strength of the American system lies not in the certainty of its actors, but in the friction between them. In a republic built on checks and balances, no single conscience, however principled, can be allowed to eclipse the mechanisms designed to test and constrain it. By the end, Kennedy had not declared victory, and Yates had not conceded defeat. That was precisely the point. The Constitution does not require winners and losers in every exchange. It requires clarity about roles, limits, and authority. The hearing had provided that clarity without fanfare, leaving behind a question that would resonate far beyond that room. When conscience and process collide, which one should prevail? And who gets to decide when they do? The room emptied slowly after the cameras shut off. Staffers gathering notes, senators exchanging quiet remarks. Outside, the political world moved on, already framing the hearing through partisan lenses. But beneath those narratives, the core question remained intact, resistant to spin. In moments of intense conviction, does the rule of law bend to belief? Or does belief submit to the rule of law? The hearing did not answer that question definitively. It did something more enduring. It forced the country to ask it again.